What could possibly make a millionaire, surrounded by luxury, power, and prestige, suddenly stop in his tracks after refusing to help a starving child? Think about it for a moment. A man who has everything at his fingertips, the kind of person who can buy whatever he desires with a single swipe of a card. Yet in one unexpected instant, a simple detail shatters the wall of arrogance he's built around himself. That detail isn't a pile of money or a business deal or even a rival's downfall. It's a necklace. Yes, a fragile silver necklace worn by a poor, hungry boy on the streets of New York. And in that moment, everything changes. Imagine the scene. The cold wind cuts through the Manhattan streets, where glowing signs from diners and corner stores promise warmth and comfort, if only you have the means to pay for it. A black luxury car glides to a stop near the sidewalk, its polished exterior reflecting the city lights like a mirror of wealth. Inside sits Michael, a man whose name carries weight in boardrooms and on Wall Street. His life is a portrait of success: tailored suits, expensive watches, a penthouse with a skyline view. To him, poverty is nothing more than a problem society will never solve, a shadow that doesn't belong in his world. But on this particular night, the shadow takes form in the shape of Ethan, a frail 9-year-old boy sitting on the curb. His jacket is torn, his shoes are too small, and his stomach growls louder than the honking cabs that rush past. He looks up with timid eyes, eyes that carry both fear and hope, and whispers the simplest request: "Sir, do you have something I can eat?" Now let me ask you, how would you respond? Have you ever walked past someone in need and even for a split second convinced yourself they didn't matter? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. Michael doesn't soften. He looks down at the boy with the cold detachment of someone who has forgotten what hunger feels. Like someone who believes every man must pull himself up or be left behind. "Get out of the way," he mutters, dismissing Ethan as nothing more than an inconvenience. In his world, compassion is a weakness, and kindness is a luxury he cannot afford. But then, as Ethan begins to step away, Michael notices something glint under the dim streetlight. Around the child's neck hangs a necklace, not flashy, not new, but old and worn, as if it had been touched by years of memories. It's a silver locket. Simple in design, but strangely familiar. Michael leans forward, unable to resist his own curiosity. Why would a boy dressed in rags carry something that belongs in another world, a world that looks eerily like his own past? The sight of that necklace is about to drag him into memories he thought he'd buried forever. And in just a moment, Michael's heart, hardened by years of success and arrogance, will be pierced in a way he never imagined. What you're about to hear is not just a story of wealth versus poverty. It's about how one small detail, a forgotten object, a fragile connection to the past, can remind us of who we truly are. It's about the thin line that separates indifference from compassion, and the moment life forces us to see what we've tried so hard to ignore. So stay with me, because the story of Michael and Ethan is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. And as we pause right here, let me ask you something, not about Michael, not even about Ethan, but about you. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this in your own life? A situation where you saw someone in need, and for a second, your instinct battled with your excuses? If this thought stirs something inside you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Your words matter not just to me, but to everyone who gathers here to reflect on stories that challenge the way we see the world. Sometimes a simple comment can spark connection, and who knows, what you share might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if this story so far has made you feel something, whether it's anger at injustice, empathy for Ethan, or even curiosity about what's going to happen next, go ahead and tap the like button. It may seem like a small action, but it helps this message reach more people who need a reminder that compassion can change lives. Most of all, if you feel at home in this kind of content, Stories that reveal the contrasts of life, that remind us of resilience, humility, and the power of small details. Then subscribe and stay close. Every time you do, you're helping build a community of people who don't just consume stories, but carry their lessons into the real world. This isn't just about numbers or algorithms. It's about keeping alive a space where empathy, reflection, and transformation can flourish. So let's keep walking together in this story. Because what Michael is about to discover, hidden within that necklace, will shake him to his core, and you'll want to see how it unfolds. Michael Grant had always believed that life was nothing more than a scoreboard, wins and losses, assets and debts. To him, New York City wasn't just a home. It was a battlefield where only the sharpest minds and boldest decisions survived. Tonight, as his sleek black Mercedes rolled down Fifth Avenue, the city lights reflected back at him like a mirror of his own achievements. The leather interior smelled of success, the kind of success he told himself he had, built with sweat and relentless discipline. In Michael's world, every luxury was proof that he had made the right choices, that he had outworked and outsmarted everyone else. The truth, however, was that behind the tinted glass and the polished steel of his life, Michael carried a mindset hardened by years of superiority. He didn't just see wealth as comfort, he saw it as validation. Each deal closed, each investment doubled, was another reminder that he was right about the world. You make your own fortune. If you don't, that's on you. It was a phrase he often repeated, sometimes aloud in business meetings, other times quietly to himself whenever he passed a beggar on the street. In his eyes, poverty wasn't misfortune, it was failure. He gripped the wheel with a calm certainty, his designer watch glinting under the dashboard lights. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with energy, street vendors calling out prices for pretzels, neon signs flickering above crowded diners, cabs honking in. Impatience, but none of it touched Michael. He lived above it all, insulated by his wealth, removed from the daily grind that defined the lives of millions of others in the city. If someone asked him when was the last time he truly walked the streets like an ordinary man, he wouldn't be able to answer. People waste too much time making excuses, he muttered as he waited at a red light. Hungry? Work harder. Cold? Find a way. His voice carried the sharpness of a man convinced that his own journey was proof of a universal truth. Success was always possible if only you wanted it badly enough. But if you looked closer, his conviction wasn't just confidence, it was armor. He wore his ego like a shield, protecting himself from the uncomfortable reality that not everyone's story began in the same place. Michael never allowed himself to consider the hidden truth, that behind every ragged coat or empty stomach was a journey he didn't understand, a life shaped by decisions and circumstances far outside anyone's control. For him, admitting that would weaken the narrative he had built for himself, the story where he was the hero who had earned it all. The Mercedes glided past a group of workers heading home, their faces tired, their jackets thin against the biting cold. Michael glanced at them briefly, then looked away, uninterested. To him, they were background characters in a play where he alone was the protagonist. Their struggles didn't inspire empathy. They simply confirmed what he already believed, that some people weren't cut out for more. Yet under the layers of arrogance, there was a trace of memory he tried to ignore. Somewhere deep inside, Michael remembered a time when his own family wasn't wealthy, when survival wasn't guaranteed by money in the bank, but by the quiet sacrifices of someone who had once cared for him more than anyone else. He buried that thought quickly, tightening his jaw. Dwelling on the past, he told himself, was a weakness. Forward motion, that was the key. Always forward. His phone buzzed with a notification from an investment group chat, pulling his focus back to numbers, charts, and projections. He smiled. This was his world. The thrill of deals, the impact of his decisions echoing across markets. It gave him control, and with control came power. Power to shape not just his destiny, but to dominate anyone who doubted him. At the next light, a homeless man tapped gently on his window, holding up a cardboard sign. Michael didn't even lower the glass. He simply waved him away, a practiced gesture of indifference. "Not tonight," he said under his breath, as though dismissing a waiter offering the wrong bottle of wine. The man stepped back, and Michael's attention returned to the glowing towers ahead. His penthouse was waiting, the skyline stretching like a trophy shelf beyond its windows. Everything he had built was proof, he believed, that the world rewarded the strong and punished the weak. That was the transformation he often bragged about, from nothing to everything. What he never admitted, even to himself, was that his version of nothing had never looked like the kind of desperation that sat shivering on city sidewalks. That night, however, as his car slowed once more near a small diner, something different happened. A smaller figure, barely more than a child, stood in the corner of his vision. Michael almost ignored it, the way he always did. But something in the boy's posture, something in the way he stood still despite the cold wind whipping through the streets, made Michael glance twice. And though his mind was quick to dismiss him as just another reminder of failure, fate was already preparing to unravel the certainty he thought was unshakable. Because sometimes the most powerful revelations don't come from the boardroom or the markets. They come from the quiet moments you try to overlook, the encounters that seem insignificant until they shatter the narrative you've been living by. Michael had no idea that the next few minutes would drag him into a story he couldn't control, a story that would test not just his power, but the very mindset that had defined his entire journey. And as the traffic light flickered back to green, his car moved forward, inching him closer to the encounter that would begin to strip away the armor he thought he would never need to remove. The night air bit hard against Ethan's skin, sharp and unrelenting, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your body, but seeps straight into your bones. He sat hunched on the curb just outside a small diner, his knees tucked close to his chest, trying to capture even the faintest warmth rising from the building's vents. Through the glass window, he could see families gathered around steaming plates, their laughter mixing with the clatter of silverware. The smell of burgers and fries drifted out each time the door opened, and it felt like torture. For 2 days, he hadn't eaten more than scraps. Half a sandwich someone had left behind, a crust of bread he'd pulled from a trash bin. Hunger wasn't new to him, but this time it felt heavier, pressing down with the weight of exhaustion. His jacket was thin, barely more than a piece of fabric with broken buttons, and the sleeves stopped short of his wrists. His shoes had holes so wide that every step through puddles soaked his socks in seconds. Still, he sat quietly, waiting, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would notice him. He had learned early on that begging too loudly only pushed people away. But sometimes, when desperation built too strong inside him, the words slipped out anyway. A car engine rumbled close by, deeper and smoother than the rattling taxis that usually passed. Ethan looked up and saw the sleek black Mercedes pulling to the curb. The shiny body reflected the neon lights from the diner's sign, Sam's Grill, bending them into ripples of green and red across the hood. For a moment, Ethan thought of how strange it was that one car could look like a mansion on wheels, while he didn't even have a proper blanket to his name. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Maybe this time, he whispered under his breath, gathering the courage he barely had left. As the car window lowered just slightly, he saw the man inside, sharp suit, polished demeanor, the kind of face that never looked worried about where the next meal was coming from. The man's eyes didn't meet his right away. They were fixed on his phone, scanning messages that Ethan could only imagine were about numbers bigger than he'd ever count. "Sir," Ethan's voice cracked, fragile but insistent. He cleared his throat and tried again, a little louder this time. "Sir, do you have something I could eat?" The words hung in the air like a plea carried on the wind. He wasn't asking for money, wasn't asking for anything more than a bite of food. In his mind, it wasn't even charity. It was survival. Michael finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he registered the child standing in the cold. He saw the pale face, the trembling hands, the jacket that couldn't keep away even a fraction of the wind. But behind those details, his instinct wasn't compassion. It was irritation. His life had taught him to see every request like this as a distraction, an obstacle, a reminder of what he believed people did to themselves through bad choices. "Kid, move along," Michael muttered, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. "This isn't the place." His hand tightened on the steering wheel, ready to pull away, but Ethan didn't move. He stayed rooted to the spot, though his knees wobbled beneath him. He wasn't trying to challenge the man, he simply had nothing left to lose. His eyes lifted once more, wide and filled with a quiet kind of desperation. "Please, I just need something to eat." It was more than a request. It was the last flicker of hope in a world that had shown him little kindness. His small voice, drowned by the roar of passing traffic and the hum of the city, carried more weight than he realized. Because in that brief exchange, even as Michael dismissed him, something stirred. A faint awareness that this wasn't just another anonymous face in the night. Ethan lowered his gaze, shuffling back a step as if preparing to retreat. His fingers touched the small object hanging from his neck, the one thing he never let go of, the necklace that had belonged to his mother. He clutched it like a secret, unaware that it was the very thing about to pierce through the armor of the man in the car. Michael shifted in his seat, the irritation still present, but his eyes flickered once more toward the child, and that was when the faint gleam of silver caught the glow of the diner lights, drawing his attention to something he couldn't ignore. What seemed at first like just another beggar's story was about to take on a weight far heavier than Michael had ever expected. The boy's pale face, the fragile voice, and now the necklace. It was as if the city itself had conspired to stop Michael from driving away. Michael's gaze hardened, the kind of look that had silenced interns in conference rooms and sent rivals stumbling during negotiations. To him, this child's request was no different than a pointless interruption during a $1 million call. His voice came out sharp, cutting through the air with a cruelty that felt almost effortless. "You think the world owes you something? Go ask someone else. Don't waste my time." The words were like ice, heavier than the winter wind whipping between the buildings. Michael leaned back in his seat, his jaw set, his mind already shifting back toward the glowing notifications on his phone. He wanted this moment gone, erased, as if the boy's presence could somehow stain the carefully polished image of his night. Ethan didn't flinch the way Michael expected. Instead, he lowered his eyes, shoulders tightening as though bracing for something he had endured too many times before. There was no anger in his face, no loud protest, no desperate attempt to convince, only silence. Silent pain, silent dignity. That quiet response was louder than any scream could have been. Michael's irritation grew. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, trying to drown out the discomfort crawling into his chest. "Don't just stand there," he snapped again, harsher this time. "Move!" Ethan finally took a step back, his small shoes scraping against the cracked pavement. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, his expression carried something Michael hadn't expected. Not weakness, but a flicker of resilience. As if the boy, in his frailty, was silently telling him, "I've survived worse than your rejection." And that unspoken truth unsettled Michael more than he wanted to admit. He had built his empire on the belief that strength was loud, that power demanded presence, that control was proven by crushing anything that stood in the way. Yet, here was a child, trembling from hunger, refusing to beg again, holding his ground without defiance. That quiet strength was foreign to Michael's world, a kind of strength he couldn't quantify in dollars or contracts. Inside the diner, laughter burst from a booth, the sound of a family enjoying plates stacked with food. Ethan's head tilted ever so slightly toward the glass, his eyes catching the reflection of steaming plates and warm smiles. But he didn't push further. He simply swallowed the lump in his throat and whispered softly, barely audible even in the stillness of the street, "Sorry, sir." Those two words weren't just an apology. They carried the weight of a child who had learned, far too early, that even his needs could be seen as an inconvenience. And though Michael told himself he didn't care, though he tightened his grip on the wheel as if to drive the moment away, something about the boy's quiet retreat pressed against the edges of his certainty. Rejection was nothing new to Ethan. It had become part of his daily rhythm, as familiar as the gnawing ache in his stomach. But every time it happened, every time someone dismissed him as nothing more than a nuisance, he carried it in silence, never letting the world see just how much it cut. He had promised himself that no matter how cruel people could be, he wouldn't let them steal the last piece of dignity he still held. Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head as though to free himself from the sting of guilt that tried to rise. "It's not my problem," he muttered under his breath. He believed it, or at least he wanted to. Helping meant responsibility, and responsibility meant vulnerability. His life had no room for that. Yet, as his eyes lingered just a second longer on Ethan's small frame under the neon glow of the diner, the arrogance that usually carried him felt strangely hollow. Because sometimes it's not the loud clashes in life that leave the deepest marks. It's the quiet ones, the moments when silence answers cruelty with dignity, when a fragile figure forces you to see the hidden truth about your own choices. Michael blinked, ready to drive away, but his gaze caught on something he hadn't noticed before. A faint shimmer of silver resting against Ethan's chest, glinting under the harsh streetlight. It was small, almost insignificant at first glance, yet something about it pulled at him, tugging his attention away from the rejection he had just delivered and toward a detail that seemed to carry a weight far greater than its size. The necklace shifted slightly as Ethan moved, and Michael felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Ethan's shoulders sagged as he began to step back, his small frame swallowed by the shadows of the diner's neon glow. Michael gripped the wheel tighter, ready to push the accelerator and put this entire uncomfortable encounter behind him. But just as the boy turned, the dim streetlight caught a glimmer against his chest, a faint shine of silver, barely visible beneath the frayed collar of his jacket. It was subtle, almost hidden, yet it caught Michael's attention like a spark in the dark. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't just a trinket. The object hung with an odd kind of weight, an old locket worn thin at the edges, its surface scratched from years of use. The chain itself looked fragile, as though it could snap at any moment, but the way Ethan clutched at it instinctively when he moved told a different story. This wasn't decoration. This was something sacred. Michael leaned slightly forward in his seat, frowning. "Where'd you get that?" His own voice surprised him. He hadn't meant to speak, hadn't meant to care, but the sight of that locket stirred something in the back of his memory, a restless shadow he couldn't ignore. Ethan froze, his small hand instinctively covering the locket. He turned slowly, his expression wary, his eyes unsure if this was another insult waiting to fall. "It was my mom's," he said softly, the words trembling but steady enough to carry across the hum of the street. For the first time since pulling up, Michael actually looked at him, really looked at him. The boy's cheeks hollowed from hunger, his shoes falling apart, his hands shaking in the cold. And yet, in the middle of all that, this fragile piece of jewelry shone like a relic of another life. Something about the design, the faint engraving at the corner, clawed at Michael's memory. "That necklace," Michael muttered, his voice low, more to himself than to the child. He had seen it before, years ago, though the recollection was blurred. It was like recognizing a melody without remembering the lyrics. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the man's stare, his fingers tightening around the locket. "It's all I have left of her," he whispered. "She told me to never let it go." The tone of his words carried no theatrics, no attempt to manipulate sympathy. It was a statement of fact, but also of love. Michael felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that unsettled his perfectly constructed mindset. That necklace wasn't just sentimental, it carried a story, one he wasn't prepared to confront. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the strange pull. "Your mother, where is she now?" Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment his eyes seemed older than his years, carrying the weight of loss no child should ever know. "She's gone," he said simply, his voice nearly breaking on the last word. Michael inhaled, sharply, though he tried to mask it. There was something haunting in the way Ethan spoke, something that pierced through the arrogance Michael wore like armor. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself this was just another sad story on the streets of New York. But the locket wouldn't let him. That tiny piece of silver was demanding his attention, dragging his thoughts into places he didn't want them to go. Images from his own childhood stirred, long-buried memories he had locked away behind years, of boardrooms and contracts, the faint trace of a woman's gentle voice, the echo of someone who had once cared for him when his own parents were too busy chasing fortune. He shook his head as though to clear it, but the familiarity of the locket pressed harder, relentless. Michael leaned closer, his tone sharper than before, though not with anger, more with urgency. "Let me see it. That necklace. Show me." Ethan hesitated, his instincts warning him against trust. But something in Michael's eyes, though clouded with impatience, wasn't entirely cruel anymore. Slowly, reluctantly, the boy lifted the locket from his chest, letting the faint light reveal its worn surface. Michael's breath caught. He recognized the pattern etched into the metal, the delicate swirl at the edge that no ordinary piece of jewelry would have carried. It was a detail he hadn't seen in decades, yet the recognition slammed into him with force. His world, so carefully ordered and detached, suddenly felt shaky. Beneath him, the boy standing in the cold was no longer just another nameless figure of poverty. That locket was a link, a connection that tugged at Michael's past, threatening to unravel the certainty of everything he thought he knew about himself, about his journey, about the very foundations of his beliefs. And for the first time in years, the man who thought he had all the answers found himself with a question he couldn't ignore. Who exactly was this child standing before him, and what hidden truth had just been placed quite literally before his eyes? Michael's pulse quickened as his eyes locked onto the locket, his chest tightening with a sensation he hadn't felt in years. That small piece of silver wasn't just jewelry. It was a key unlocking a door he had kept bolted shut. He swallowed, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Open it. Let me see what's inside." Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing over the clasp as if protecting it. For him, this wasn't just metal and glass. It was memory, love, and loss, all bound together. He looked at Michael warily, unsure why this stranger suddenly cared. But after a long pause, he carefully flipped the locket open. The hinge squeaked softly, revealing a tiny, faded photograph tucked behind the glass. Michael leaned closer, and the sight hit him like a wave crashing into stone. The face looking back from the picture was one he knew all too well. A young woman smiling softly, her eyes filled with a warmth he remembered from nights long ago. His breath caught. "No, it can't be," he whispered, though deep down he knew it was true. Ethan clutched the locket tighter, his voice fragile but steady. "That's my mum. She wore this every day until she got sick. She told me to keep it close, so I'd never forget her. She said it would remind me I was loved." His words trembled, but there was no bitterness, only the weight of longing. For a moment, the noise of the city seemed to vanish. Michael wasn't in his Mercedes, wasn't surrounded by neon lights or the smell of street food drifting from the diner. He was back in his childhood home, a sprawling house filled with marble floors and expensive silence. His parents were always gone, business trips, parties, meetings, and in their absence there was only one person who had made that house feel alive. Her name was Grace. She was the nanny who had practically raised him, the one who told him bedtime stories when no one else bothered, who bandaged his scraped knees, who held him when storms rattled the windows and fear made him small. She had been the constant presence in a home where love was rationed like a luxury item, and there she was, staring at him again through the glass of a child's necklace. Michael's throat tightened as memories surged, the sound of her laughter in the kitchen, the way she hummed lullabies when she thought no one was listening. He remembered her kindness, her patience, the way she always reminded him that he was more than the name on the front gate. And now, standing before him, was her son. Ethan looked down, his thumb brushing over the tiny photo. She used to work for a rich family here in the city. She told me their house was so big you could get lost inside, but she said the boy she looked after, he wasn't lost because she made sure of it. She said he was like her own. Michael felt his chest tighten, every word piercing through his defenses. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself this was coincidence, but the truth was undeniable. The boy she had spoken of, it was him. He was the child Grace had cared for, the one who had been given everything money could buy, but still needed the love she had so freely given. He blinked rapidly, struggling to mask the storm inside. "Your mother, Grace?" he asked, his voice breaking on her name. Ethan's head snapped up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. You knew her?" Michael nodded slowly, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. She was more than a nanny. She was family. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like he was admitting a hidden truth he had buried for decades. Ethan's lips trembled, but a small spark lit in his eyes. She always talked about that boy. She said he was smart, stubborn sometimes, but with a good heart. She hoped he'd grow up to be kind. The sentence landed heavy. Michael's heart twisted at the irony. Here he was, a man who had built his life on wealth and power, standing in front of the son of the only person who had ever truly shown him unconditional care, and he had just rejected him like he was nothing. The impact of that realization cracked something deep inside. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. I didn't know." Ethan shrugged lightly, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Most people didn't. She didn't have much, but she gave everything to me. And even when she got sick, she told me not to be afraid. She said kindness always finds its way back, even if it takes a long time." Those words echoed in Michael's mind like a judgment and a gift all at once. He had spent years convinced that success was measured in bank accounts and towers of glass, that the world respected only strength. Yet the one person who had mattered most in his childhood had believed in something entirely different, a mindset built on compassion, not competition. And now her son, hungry and cold on a street corner, stood as living proof of that belief. Michael felt the air in his chest grow heavy. The hidden truth he had spent years avoiding had revealed itself, not in a boardroom, not in the rise and fall of markets, but in the trembling hands of a 9-year-old boy clutching a silver locket. And with that revelation, the foundations of his certainty began to shift. He stared at Ethan, at the child who should have been invisible to him, yet now felt impossibly close. A part of him wanted to look away, to retreat back into the safety of indifference. But another part, buried deep for so long, refused to let go. And in that silence between them, Michael understood that his journey, one built on pride and detachment, was about to take a turn he could no longer control. Michael froze, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, but without strength, as if the leather beneath his palm had suddenly turned to ice. The noise of the city dulled around him, the taxis honking, the conversations spilling out from the diner, the faint hum of the neon sign. All of it faded into the background. In its place rose a wave of memories he had never invited back, memories of warmth and safety that clashed violently with the man he had become. He remembered Grace's hands, steady and gentle, smoothing his hair when storms rattled the windows of that enormous empty house. He remembered her voice, low and calming, weaving bedtime stories that pulled him away from loneliness. She wasn't just a caretaker, she had been his anchor in a home where his parents were always gone, chasing profits and prestige. Grace had been the one to remind him that he was more than a surname etched on glass doors. And now, staring at her son, standing frail and hungry in front of him, Michael felt the ground beneath his certainty collapse. His throat tightened. The child's eyes, though clouded by exhaustion and hunger, carried the same quiet strength Grace had once shown in moments of hardship. That look of endurance, of quiet defiance against pain, was unmistakable. He saw her in the tilt of Ethan's head, in the calm persistence behind his gaze, and it pierced Michael in a way no business rival or financial setback ever could. Inside his chest, guilt spread like wildfire, burning through the arrogance he had worn like armor. For years he had convinced himself that compassion was weakness, that those who struggled simply hadn't worked hard enough. But how could he reconcile that belief now, when the boy before him was the living legacy of the only person who had ever given him genuine love? Michael's jaw clenched as he tried to maintain the cold facade, but his voice betrayed him. "I knew her," he said, softer than he intended. "Your mother, she was—" He stopped, swallowing hard, unable to finish. Ethan's eyes flickered with surprise. "You knew my mom?" His small hand gripped the locket tightly, as though protecting the last piece of her he still carried. Michael nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the photo inside the necklace. "She took care of me when I was your age, more than anyone else ever did." He forced the words out, each one heavy with the weight of hidden truth he could no longer deny. The impact of the moment struck him like a punch to the gut. He had just turned his back on this boy, dismissed him with cruelty, told him to move along as if he were nothing. And yet this child wasn't just another face in the sea of poverty Michael had taught himself to ignore. This was Grace's son, the boy she had loved and raised on her own, the boy she had trusted the world would somehow treat better than it had treated her. Shame carved into him, deeper than he thought possible. His mind replayed his own words, sharp, dismissive, heartless, and for the first time in years, Michael hated himself for the decisions he had made, not in business but in life. The transformation happening within him wasn't subtle, it was raw, immediate, and merciless. He could almost hear Grace's voice again, whispering the lessons she used to teach him when he was too stubborn to. "Listen, money doesn't define you, Michael. What you give, what you share, that's who you are." At the time, he had brushed it off as sentimental nonsense. But now, as her son stood shivering in the cold with empty hands and an empty stomach, those words echoed with a truth he could no longer escape. Michael's breath came shallow, his chest rising and falling with a conflict he didn't know how to resolve. His carefully constructed identity, the ruthless, untouchable businessman who owed nothing to anyone, was unraveling in the span of minutes. He wasn't just looking at a boy, he was looking at a mirror of his past, at a debt of love and kindness he had never repaid. Ethan lowered his gaze again, mistaking Michael's silence for rejection. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice fragile. "You don't have to care. Nobody ever does." Those words struck deeper than any accusation could have. Michael felt the sting of them, not just in his mind, but in his very core. Nobody ever does. But Grace had cared. Grace had given everything she had, even when it left her with nothing. And now her son stood on a street corner starving, while he, Michael, sat in a car worth more than the diner behind them. The contrast was unbearable. He blinked hard, his eyes stinging in a way he refused to acknowledge. For the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind ego or wealth. He couldn't calculate his way out of this. This wasn't a negotiation or a contract. This was a human truth slamming into him. With relentless force, the silence between them grew heavy, charged with the weight of what had been revealed. Michael's fingers trembled slightly against the wheel as he realized the enormity of the moment. His life, defined by cold decisions and rigid beliefs, had just been cracked open by a silver locket and the fragile voice of a hungry child. And as he stared at Ethan, at Grace's son, the man who once believed kindness was a weakness, found himself on the edge of a revelation that would change not only his decisions tonight, but the very course of his journey. Michael's chest tightened as Ethan's quiet words echoed in his head. Nobody ever does. For a man who had built an entire empire on decisiveness, he suddenly felt paralyzed. His hand lingered on the wheel, torn between instinct and something deeper rising from within. Pride told him to drive away, to pretend this encounter never happened. But the weight of Grace's memory and the boy's fragile dignity pressed down harder than any. deal or contract ever had. In a sudden, almost uncharacteristic move, Michael shoved the gear into park and pushed the door open. The cold Manhattan air rushed against his face, shocking him into clarity. He strode toward Ethan with a determination that surprised even himself. Without saying much, he placed a hand gently but firmly on the boy's shoulder. "Come on," he said, his tone no longer sharp but commanding in a different way. "You're coming inside." Ethan blinked, startled. "Inside? You mean the diner?" His voice carried disbelief, as though the invitation itself was too generous to be real. Michael gave a short nod, his throat tightening. "Yes, now, before we both freeze out here." The door to Sam's Grill creaked as they stepped inside, a burst of warm air washing over them. The contrast was immediate. Ethan's trembling eased slightly, and Michael felt his own body relax, though his mind was still in turmoil. The smell of sizzling bacon, frying onions, and fresh coffee filled the air. Waitresses darted between tables, and a jukebox in the corner hummed a low tune from decades past. They slid into a booth, Michael on one side, Ethan across from him. The waitress appeared, pen poised over her notepad, but before she could speak, Michael cut in. "Get him whatever he wants, the biggest plate you've got, and a hot chocolate." Ethan looked at him, eyes wide, as if unsure whether he was allowed to choose. His voice was timid. "Could I maybe have pancakes? And eggs, too?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Pancakes, eggs, bacon, sausage, toast, the works. Bring it all." The waitress scribbled quickly, casting a curious glance at the pair before rushing back to the counter. Ethan stared at the empty table, his hands clasped tightly together, trying not to seem too eager. But when the food arrived minutes later, stacked high and steaming, the boy's restraint broke. He picked up the fork with trembling hands, taking a bite so fast he almost burned his tongue. Then another, and another, as if every bite was proof that this moment was real. Michael sat silently, his gaze fixed on the boy devouring the meal, each motion pulling him deeper into a space he hadn't visited in years. For once, he didn't feel like a man measuring worth by power or money. Watching Ethan eat, he felt something disarmingly human, a quiet connection that stripped away the layers of arrogance he had carried for so long. Grace's son, a child who had inherited her strength, her quiet resilience, even in the face of hunger and hardship. Michael rested his elbows on the table, his hands clasped in front of his mouth. The businessman in him, the man used to calculating outcomes, searched for an explanation. But this wasn't a boardroom, and there was no strategy here. It was simply one human being watching another survive, and the impact of that realization was undeniable. Ethan glanced up mid-bite, cheeks full, eyes wary as if afraid the generosity would be snatched away at any second. "I can pay you back someday," he said, his words muffled but sincere. "When I'm older, I'll find a way." Michael's chest tightened again. He shook his head slowly, his voice low. "You don't owe me anything." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he didn't stop eating, each forkful disappearing as quickly as it landed on his plate. Michael found himself strangely comforted by the sight. It wasn't the kind of comfort he usually sought, no fine wine, no stock numbers flashing green. This was different. It was raw, unpolished, but real. As Ethan ate, Michael's mind drifted. He thought of his own childhood dinners, lavish meals served on long tables where his parents were rarely present. He thought of how Grace used to sneak him cookies when the silence of the house grew too heavy. And now, across from him, her son was finding comfort in a warm plate of food she would never get to serve him. The hidden truth landed hard. His success had built walls, but kindness tore them down in seconds. For the first time in years, he wasn't above anyone. He wasn't superior. He was simply a man sitting in a diner booth with a hungry child, rediscovering what it meant to feel alive, to feel connected, to feel human. Ethan slowed down as the plate emptied, his small hand wrapping around the mug of hot chocolate. He held it close, letting the steam warm his face. "This is the best thing I've had in a long time," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. Michael nodded, unable to trust his own voice. His thoughts swirled, a mix of guilt, revelation, and a strange kind of peace. He knew that this wasn't just about feeding a boy for one night. It was about confronting the mindset that had led him to dismiss Ethan in the first place. It was about Grace, about what she had taught him, about the kind of man he had promised himself he'd never need to become. Cold, detached, untouchable. Yet here he was, touched in a way that dismantled all of it. The diner buzzed around. Them, waitresses calling out orders, plates clattering, the jukebox skipping to another song. But for Michael, time seemed to slow. He realized he was no longer looking at Ethan as a stranger or a nuisance. He was looking at him as a connection, a reminder, a turning point in a journey he hadn't even realized he was still on. And as Ethan leaned back against the booth, his hunger finally quieted. Michael's gaze softened. What had started as an inconvenience on a cold New York night was becoming something he couldn't define, but knew he couldn't ignore. Something had shifted, something irreversible. Michael sat there for a long moment, his eyes tracing the empty plate that only minutes ago had been piled high with food. Ethan leaned back against the booth, exhaustion softening his small frame now that hunger no longer gnawed at him. The boy's eyelids fluttered, heavy from the sudden comfort of a full stomach and the warmth of the diner. For Michael, that simple image, Grace's son, finally, at rest, even for a moment, was more powerful than any contract he had ever signed. The realization settled deep inside him. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. He had spent years convincing himself that his life was built on self-reliance, that every person was responsible for their own journey. But here sat a child whose path had been shaped by circumstances he never chose. Michael knew Grace would never forgive him if he abandoned her son to the streets she had once shielded him from. He pulled out his wallet, not with the detached efficiency of a man used to throwing money at problems, but with a newfound sense of purpose. He slipped bills under the check, enough to cover not just the meal, but to ensure Ethan could return to this place again if he ever needed to. Then he turned to the boy, his voice low but steady. "You're not going back out there tonight. Not like this." Ethan blinked, caught between disbelief and a fragile hope. "What do you mean?" Michael exhaled, as if steadying himself. "I'll make sure you have a roof, a bed, something more than a curb and a cold night. It's the least I can do for you and for her." His eyes dropped briefly to the locket, that fragile chain of silver that had tied the two of them back together. The boy's lips parted, but he didn't know what to say. Gratitude and confusion swirled in his expression. "But why me?" he whispered, the innocence of the question cutting deeper than Michael expected. Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to say it was because of Grace, because of everything she had given him when he had been no older than Ethan. But it was more than that. It was because in this boy's resilience, in his quiet endurance, Michael saw the reflection of a truth he had buried beneath layers of arrogance. "Because you matter," he said finally, the words tasting unfamiliar but right. "And because your mother once saved me from a kind of hunger too, not the kind food fixes, the kind you feel when no one seems to care." As they stepped out of the diner, the winter wind cut sharp again, but this time Michael didn't feel its bite in the same way. He led Ethan toward the car, opening the door for him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The boy hesitated for a second, glancing back at the street corner where he had stood minutes ago, then climbed inside, curling into the warmth of the leather seat. Driving through the city streets, Michael's mind spun with the weight of decisions ahead. This wasn't just about one night's shelter or one hot meal. It was about responsibility, about redemption, about rewriting the hidden narrative of his life that he had ignored for too long. The necklace, once just a glint of silver in the dark, had become a bridge, linking his past with Grace, his present with Ethan, and his future with a choice he could no longer avoid. The skyline stretched above them, towers of glass and steel glowing against the night sky. For years, Michael had seen that view as a symbol of victory, proof that he had conquered the city. But tonight it looked different, less like a trophy and more like a challenge. What was the worth of all this power if he couldn't use it to honor the only person who had ever taught him what love meant? He tightened his grip on the wheel, his voice breaking the silence. "Ethan, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. School, food, a place where you don't have to be afraid of tomorrow. It's what she would have wanted, and it's what I should have done a long time ago." The boy turned toward him, clutching the locket in his hand. His eyes, wide with both wonder and caution, softened as he whispered, "She always said kindness comes back when you least expect it." Michael swallowed hard, his vision blurring for a second with the sting of emotion. Grace's words, carried through her son, landed with the force of a promise he intended to keep. For the first time in decades, Michael didn't feel like a man chasing numbers. He felt like a man chasing meaning. The car rolled forward, headlights cutting through the darkness, guiding them both toward something neither of them had fully imagined. And as the city stretched out before them, Michael realized that this wasn't just about helping a child. It was about reclaiming the part of himself he had abandoned long ago, the part that Grace had once nurtured with patience and love. The night had begun with arrogance and dismissal, but now it carried the fragile beginnings of redemption, a transformation that couldn't be undone. And though neither of them knew exactly what the future held, the journey had already shifted in ways that would leave an impact far greater than either could see in that moment. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the city slipped by, lights flickering against the windshield like fragments of memories. Michael kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Every glance at Ethan curled into the passenger seat, clutching the silver locket, reminded him of how fragile and powerful life could be all at once. The boy wasn't just surviving, he was carrying the legacy of a woman who had once poured every ounce of love into him when no one else had bothered. And that realization stirred something Michael had buried beneath years of ambition. He thought of all the decisions that had defined his journey, the ruthless negotiations, the nights spent chasing profit, the walls he had built around himself in the name of strength. Each one had been meant to protect him, to prove that he was untouchable. But tonight, a single child had torn through those defenses without even trying, not through force, not through cleverness, but through quiet resilience and a necklace that carried the weight of truth. Ethan's voice broke the stillness, small but steady. "You don't have to do all this, you know. I'm used to taking care of myself." Michael's jaw tightened, and he shook his head slightly. "No child should ever be used to that," he replied, the words heavier than he expected. "I let myself forget what really matters, Ethan. Your mother tried to teach me, and I ignored it, but I won't ignore it now." The boy looked at him, his eyes searching for sincerity. Whatever he saw seemed to settle him, because he leaned back against the seat with a faint sigh, still holding the locket close. For Michael, that simple gesture was more powerful than any handshake or deal he had ever sealed. It was trust, not easily given, but offered in a quiet, fragile way that felt like redemption. As the streets stretched ahead, Michael's mind replayed Grace's words, her gentle reminders that love could outlast even the harshest storms. He realized that he had spent his entire adult life chasing the wrong kind of wealth. His empire, his possessions, his status, they had all been built on the illusion that money defined worth. But in the end, it was the memory of a woman's kindness and the presence of her son that showed him the hidden truth. Wealth without compassion was nothing more than emptiness dressed in gold. He felt his chest loosen, a weight lifting that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For years, he had thought strength meant never bending, never giving in. But tonight proved the opposite. True strength was in the courage to care, in the decision to see another's pain and do something about it. Sometimes, Michael thought aloud, his voice almost like he was confessing to the night. What we refuse to see in others is exactly what saves us from losing ourselves. His eyes flickered toward the boy beside him, who was now fighting to stay awake, his small frame finally at ease for the first time in days. A necklace reminded me that love, not money, is what makes us truly rich. The truth of that sentence lingered, hanging in the air with the gravity of a revelation. It wasn't just about Grace or Ethan anymore. It was about every decision, every interaction, every chance to look beyond the surface and find the humanity we often ignore. The car rolled past the familiar landmarks of the city, but Michael no longer saw them as trophies of success. They were simply buildings, shadows in the background of a larger story. What mattered now was the boy in the seat beside him and the lesson he had unknowingly carried. And as the night pressed on, a question formed in Michael's mind, one he couldn't shake, one that seemed to extend far beyond his own experience. He wondered how many lives had been overlooked, how many hidden truths were waiting in plain sight, disguised as nuisances or inconveniences. What small detail, he thought silently, his gaze steady on the road ahead, could change the way you see someone today? And if you made it all the way here with me, that already says something about the way this story touched you. Maybe it brought back a memory. Maybe it stirred a thought you hadn't considered before. If that's the case, I'd love for you to leave a comment below with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." It's a simple way for us to know this message found its place. And if this journey resonated with you, give the video a like. It helps more than you imagine, keeping these kinds of stories alive and reaching people who might need them. And of course, if you want to keep walking through narratives that mix reflection, hidden truths, and transformation, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Before you go, though, don't stop here. There's a video right beside this one that ties perfectly into the message we explored tonight. Click there and let's continue together.